"Get out of my sight," the millionaire shouted during his honeymoon. But what happened after those words no one expected. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss the emotional ending. The Waterford crystal goblet shattered against the Vermont slate floor with the violence of a breaking heart. Fragments scattered constellations of Napa Cabernet across the terrace of the most exclusive inn in Woodstock, while the last lights of dusk painted the colonial walls in shades of purple. The echo of impact reverberated between the white pillars like an omen no one knew how to interpret in that instant. Lorelei felt the air trapped in her throat, dense as maple syrup from the surrounding hills. Her ivory linen dress, the one she'd chosen so carefully for their third night of honeymoon, rippled softly around her ankles like ocean foam. But she didn't feel the breeze. She felt nothing except the cold beginning to climb up her spine as she watched the man who had sworn to love her eternally just 3 days earlier. Whitfield Ashford Thorne had his face contorted into a mask of fury she'd never seen during the 4 months of their whirlwind courtship in Boston. His steel-grey eyes, the ones Lorelei had found so magnetic in the cafes of Beacon Hill and the restaurants of Back Bay, now looked like burning coals fixed on the elderly man who'd had the audacity to stumble near him. "Get out of my way!" The shout erupted from his throat, like lava from a dormant volcano. "Can't you watch where you're walking?" The gentleman, an 80-year-old man with a back bent by decades of labor and a carved maple cane trembling in his wrinkled hand, stepped back with eyes full of confusion and something that looked too much like fear. His lips moved without emitting sound, like a fish out of water, before murmuring barely audible apologies and shuffling away down the brick corridor. Whitfield remained motionless, his impeccable beige linen suit contrasting brutally with the violence of his expression. The Rolex on his wrist caught the last rays of the setting sun, gleaming like a cyclops' eye beneath the colonial lanterns beginning to light one by one. The aroma of lavender and wild roses from the gardens overlooking the Green Mountains now mingled with something acrid, metallic, the smell of fear and tension. Lorelei watched how the muscles in his jaw tensed and relaxed, how his hands closed into fists and opened again, as if fighting against something invisible only he could perceive. The other inn guests had discreetly disappeared, leaving them alone in that courtyard where silence weighed more than the century-old stones. She wanted to speak, wanted to ask him what the hell that had been, wanted to remind him they were on their honeymoon, that these days were supposed to be woven of tenderness and discoveries, not inexplicable explosions at innocent strangers. But the words refused to come out, trapped behind a knot growing in her chest like wild ivy. Whitfield finally looked at her. For a fleeting instant, she thought she saw something different in his eyes. Shame, perhaps, or fear, or a sadness so ancient it seemed to belong to another life. But the expression disappeared as quickly as it had come, replaced by that mask of control he wore like a second skin. "Let's go back to the room," he said in a flat voice, without apologizing, without explaining. "It's been a long day." Lorelei nodded mechanically as she followed him up the stairs of stone polished by centuries of footsteps. Each step took her further from the courtyard and closer to a truth beginning to crystallize in her mind. The man she'd married in the chapel of the Mohonk Mountain House, under a rain of peony petals and eternal promises, was a complete stranger. The suite overlooked the mountains, those peaks cutting against the sky like petrified waves. White linen curtains rippled with the night breeze, bringing aromas of wild thyme and warm stone. The four-poster bed, with its Egyptian cotton sheets and wrought-iron headboard, looked like an altar prepared for rituals that now felt impossible. Whitfield disappeared into the bathroom without a word. Lorelei heard the shower run for long minutes while she sat on the edge of the mattress, hands crossed on her lap like a punished child. Questions spun in her head like bats in a dark cave. Who was this man really? How had she not seen these signs during their courtship? What had she gotten herself into? When he emerged wrapped in the hotel's bathrobe, dark hair dripping on his temples, she tried to speak. "Whitfield, what happened down there?" "Nothing happened," he cut with surgical coldness. "A clumsy old man who doesn't watch where he walks. End of story." "But you yelled at him, you threw—" "I said nothing happened, Lorelei." The way he pronounced her name, each syllable falling like a stone in a deep well, silenced her more effectively than any shout. He slipped into bed, turning his back to her, and minutes later his breathing became heavy and regular, the sleep of someone with an anesthetized conscience. But Lorelei couldn't sleep. She lay awake with eyes fixed on the ceiling of dark beams, listening to Vermont's night sounds, owls in the maples, distant dogs, the eternal murmur of wind against the mountain rocks. Something had broken that night, something more than a crystal goblet, an illusion, perhaps, a carefully constructed hope. When the bedside clock struck 3 in the morning, she heard movement. She barely opened her eyes enough to see Whitfield rise silently, take something from his suitcase drawer, and go out to the balcony with the steps of a thief in his own life. Curiosity conquered fear. She sat up slowly, making sure the sheets didn't creak, and approached the curtains separating the bedroom from the balcony. The full moon over the mountains bathed everything in ancient silver, and in that unreal light, she saw something that would forever change her perception. Whitfield was crying, not with dramatic sobs or exaggerated gestures. He cried silently, with tears sliding down his angular cheeks, while his trembling hands held an old yellowed photograph. The image, barely visible from where she spied, showed a woman in a black coat holding a thin child with enormous eyes. A child who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders. When he sensed her presence, he put away the photo as quickly as if it burned. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at her with an indecipherable expression. "Go back to bed, Lorelei, it's nothing." But they both knew it was a lie. That night, something had begun to crack in Whitfield Ashford Thorne's armor, and she, without knowing it yet, had found the first crack through which light could enter. The following days were an exercise in silent observation for Lorelei. As they drove through the small towns of the Berkshires in their rented Mercedes, she began cataloguing her husband's contradictions with the precision of an entomologist studying an unknown species. Whitfield avoided looking waiters in the eye. In every cafe, in every restaurant, he studied the menu with excessive concentration, gave his order looking towards some undefined point on the wall, and never uttered the words "please" or "thank you." However, he left absurdly generous tips, $20 bills for $3 coffees, as if money could compensate for the coldness of his treatment. "It's just efficiency," he explained when she finally asked. "I don't need to be their friend. I need them to do their job." But there was something more. Lorelei noticed it when they passed the trailer parks in the hills of upstate New York, those shacks of tin and cardboard where entire families survived on the margins of tourist prosperity. Whitfield's hands sweated on the steering wheel, his jaw tensed until the tendons in his neck stood out like guitar strings. He accelerated almost imperceptibly, as if wanting to leave those images behind as quickly as possible. "Stop," she said suddenly. "What?" "Stop the car, now." He obeyed more from surprise than submission, stopping the vehicle on the dusty shoulder. Lorelei got out without explanation and walked toward a makeshift stand where a woman was selling hand-woven baskets under a torn awning. She bought 3 baskets she didn't need, paying triple the asking price, and returned to the car with her gaze fixed on her husband. "That was unnecessary," he muttered. "Not for her." The silence that followed was different from previous ones, less hostile, more thoughtful. Whitfield started the engine but didn't accelerate immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the rear-view mirror, watching the woman count the bills with disbelief and then cross herself looking at the sky. That night, in the room at the inn in Lenox, Lorelei discovered another piece of the puzzle. While Whitfield showered, she found his phone unlocked on the nightstand. She wasn't looking for secrets, just the weather app to plan the next day. But what she found was a history of bank transfers that left her breathless. Anonymous donations, dozens of them, to orphanages in Massachusetts, nursing homes in Maine, soup kitchens in Connecticut, amounts totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, all made through managers and foundations, with no name or trace linking them to Whitfield Ashford Thorne. The man who shouted at defenseless old men was the same one secretly financing shelters for the most vulnerable. The contradiction was so brutal that Lorelei felt vertigo, as if the ground beneath her feet had turned to quicksand. When he came out of the bathroom, she'd returned the phone to its exact place. She looked at him differently, searching for the child in the photograph in the hardened features of the businessman, trying to understand what terrible transformation had converted one into the other. "Something wrong?" he asked, noticing her scrutiny. "Nothing. Just thinking about tomorrow." It was a lie, but lies had become the common language of their marriage. He lied about who he was. She lied about what she felt. And between them both, an uncomfortable truth waited patiently to be discovered. On the third day, at the farmer's market in Hudson, the pomegranate incident occurred. The enclosure bustled with life and color, spices tinting the air with paprika and cinnamon, vendors' voices hawking their products, tourists photographing everything with hungry phones. Lorelei had moved ahead toward an olive stand when she heard the crash behind her. An elderly vendor, with gnarled hands and an apron stained with decades of work, had tripped over a misplaced crate. Her basket of ripe pomegranates rolled across the cobbled ground, the fruits escaping in all directions like drops of vegetable blood. The woman tried to bend down to pick them up, but her arthritic knees refused to cooperate. Lorelei turned just in time to see something extraordinary. Whitfield, the Iceman, the entrepreneur who treated waiters like furniture, had knelt on the dirty market floor. His fingers, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts, picked up pomegranates with the delicacy of someone handling antique crystal. When he handed the basket to the old woman, their hands touched for an instant, and his face transformed. For 3 complete seconds, Lorelei saw another man, one with soft eyes and a shy smile, one who seemed to remember something painful and sweet at the same time. But then, as if waking from a trance, Whitfield stood up abruptly. He dropped several bills on the woman's stand without looking at her, and walked away in long strides through the arcades, disappearing into the crowd. Lorelei found him 20 minutes later, sitting on a bench near the waterfront, with his gaze lost on the Hudson River. She said nothing. She simply sat beside him and waited, as one waits for a summer storm to pass. "My mother smelled like pomegranates," he said finally, without looking at her. "It's the only thing I remember about her." It was the first genuine confession he'd offered her, and though it left more questions than answers, Lorelei understood she'd just received a valuable gift, a fragment of truth in a sea of silences. The return trip to Boston was silent, but different. The silence was no longer a wall but a bridge, precarious and tottering, but a bridge nonetheless. When they arrived at the airport and he offered his hand to help her out of the taxi, she took it and squeezed gently. He didn't pull away. It was a beginning. Small as a mustard seed, fragile as a butterfly's wing. But in that minimal gesture, Lorelei found something resembling hope. The stone manor stood in the woods of Litchfield County, like a monument to solitude. 3 stories of thick walls that blocked even the birdsong in the surrounding oaks, narrow windows like half-closed eyes, and a garden where roses had long ago lost the battle against thorns. Whitfield had bought it 5 years earlier, according to him, for its architectural value from the 1790s. But Lorelei suspected deeper reasons. This house was perfect for someone wanting to hide from the world. The first days as mistress of the house were an exercise in adapting to absence. Whitfield left for New York before dawn and returned after nightfall, leaving her alone in rooms that smelled of ancient humidity and buried secrets. Staff was limited to a housekeeper who came 3 times a week and barely spoke, as if silence were a condition of employment. Lorelei explored the house with the meticulousness of an archaeologist on a forbidden excavation. Each room told a story of calculated abandonment. Furniture covered with white sheets, clocks stopped at forgotten hours, libraries full of books no one had opened in decades. The only inhabited area was the East Wing, where the master bedroom, a functional office, and the kitchen she tried to fill with aromas of life were located. It was the second week when she discovered the door. It was at the end of a hallway in the North Wing, camouflaged by a faded tapestry depicting a medieval hunting scene. Lorelei had noticed it before, but assumed it was a service closet. That afternoon, driven by boredom bordering on desperation, she pushed aside the tapestry and tried the handle. Locked. Curiosity became a discreet obsession. For days, she observed Whitfield looking for signs of hidden keys, secret schedules, any indication of what was behind that door. And then came the first night of shared insomnia. 3 in the morning had become the cursed hour. Each night, like a disturbed biological clock, she woke and he was no longer in bed. The first time she assumed it was the bathroom. The second, that he couldn't sleep and had gone down for water. The third, she decided to follow him. Lorelei's bare feet made no sound on the cold stone as she descended the stairs. The manor creaked with the sounds proper to old houses, wood expanding, wind in the chimneys, mice in the attics. But she distinguished another sound, footsteps moving away toward the north wing. She followed, keeping her distance, pressed against the shadows like the protagonist of a Gothic novel. She saw him push aside the tapestry, take a key from his robe pocket and disappear behind that mysterious door. Yellowish light filtered through the cracks for a moment before he closed from inside. She waited. A full hour sitting on the cold hallway floor, back against the wall and heart-beating, unanswered questions. When she finally heard the handle turn, she ran back to the bedroom with the agility of a frightened gazelle. She slipped into bed barely seconds before he entered, feigning a sleep impossible to feel. The next morning, while he prepared to go to New York, Lorelei made a decision. "I want to redecorate," she announced during breakfast. "This house needs life." Whitfield looked at her over his coffee cup with an indecipherable expression. "Do what you want," he responded. "It's your house too." "Good. Then I'll need access to all the rooms." The silence that followed was eloquent. She saw how his jaw tensed, how his fingers gripped the cup hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "Almost all," he corrected. "There's an annex by the old carriage house that I use for storage, confidential work material, company documents." It was a lie. Lorelei knew it with the certainty of someone who'd learned to read her interlocutor's micro-gestures, but she nodded, filing away that information for later. Understood. He seemed to visibly relax. He finished his coffee, picked up his briefcase, and stopped at the dining room door. "Lorelei," he began, and for a moment she thought he was going to confess something. "Thank you for wanting to improve this place." It wasn't what she expected, but it was something. She watched him leave down the elm-lined avenue leading to the road, the black Mercedes disappearing like a sigh into the morning mist. And then, heart racing, she searched for the duplicate keys she'd found days earlier in a kitchen drawer. The annex key wasn't there, of course not, but patience had become her new virtue. The following weeks were a silent chess match. She transformed the house with small changes, fresh flowers in vases, new curtains that let in light, art books strategically placed where he'd see them. He pretended not to notice, but she caught furtive glances, pages that appeared marked with muffin crumbs, a book on Winslow Homer on the dining room table. Days later opened to the page of Breezing Up, with a coffee stain near the luminous bodies on the sailboat, a Hopper catalogue in the office. The following week folded to the chapter of the dark paintings, those showing monsters born from the sleep of reason. Whitfield painted. She knew it now with certainty, though she had no physical proof, and in that secret activity she sensed a door to the real man hiding behind the businessman of ice. Confirmation came in the 5th week, during an electrical storm night that shook the manor like a furious giant's toy. Lightning illuminated the Connecticut sky in blinding whites, and thunder made the leaded windows vibrate. Lorelei couldn't sleep, but this time not from surveillance but from genuine ancestral fear of storms. She went down to the kitchen to make herself chamomile tea, and there she found him. Whitfield sat at the table with an almost empty bottle of bourbon and hands stained with something dark. Paint, she recognized. Prussian blue and lamp black under his nails, pigment residue in the creases of his knuckles. "I couldn't sleep," he murmured without looking up. "Me neither." She made 2 cups of tea in silence, placed one in front of him, and sat in the opposite chair. The storm roared outside, but inside that ancient kitchen something resembling peace began to germinate. "My father beat me with a belt when it rained," he said suddenly, words coming out like blood from a reopened wound. He said thunder was God's voice punishing bad children. Lorelei didn't respond. She knew any word could break the spell of that unexpected confession. "He wasn't really my father," he continued, eyes fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. "Just one of many men who tried to be. None lasted more than a year." "And your mother?" The question came out before she could contain it. Whitfield's face closed like a fortress door. "I don't have a mother." It was lie and truth at the same time. She understood it with painful clarity. He had a mother somewhere in the past, but that woman had ceased to exist in a way he still couldn't narrate. The storm passed near dawn, leaving the air clean and the garden waterlogged. When the first rays of sun entered through the kitchen window, Lorelei discovered they'd fallen asleep at the table, heads resting on crossed arms like schoolchildren at their desks. And for the first time since the wedding, she saw her husband sleep with an expression of peace. Whitfield's office was forbidden territory, not by explicit rule, but by tacit understanding. She didn't enter. He didn't explain. But that October Thursday, while searching for documents for the accounting firm managing the house taxes, Lorelei found herself obliged to cross that threshold. The room smelled of old leather and yellowed paper. Oak shelves covered the walls, full of file boxes labeled with years and categories she didn't understand. A massive desk dominated the center, with a modern computer that clashed with the 19th century atmosphere of the space, and in a corner, almost hidden behind a column of boxes, a metal filing cabinet that seemed to belong to another era. She was looking for service bills, nothing more. But while rummaging through the desk drawers, her hand stumbled upon an envelope that didn't belong there. It was hidden under a false bottom of the top drawer, so well concealed that only chance could reveal it. The envelope contained letters, dozens of them, written on institutional paper with the letterhead of Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, dates spanning 15 years of correspondence between social workers, foster care institutions, and someone whose name had been crossed out with black marker on every document. The minor presents aggressive behavior as a defense mechanism. Specialized therapy for early abandonment trauma is recommended. The adoption has been returned for the third time. The family alleges incompatibility. So as to Worcester Charitable Institution reports the subject shows signs of recovery, but rejects all physical contact. The words danced before Lorelei's eyes like specters of a life she'd never imagined. The Whitfield the world knew didn't exist until age 23. Before, there was only a child identified by numbers in social services files, a child without a proper name, a child no one wanted to keep. The last letter was different. It was addressed to Whitfield Ashford Thorne, dated 8 years ago, and bore the seal of a Boston notary. Dear Mr. Thorne, I write to inform you that, following exhaustive genealogical research, we have confirmed your status as legitimate heir to the Ashford Thorne family of Massachusetts. Your maternal grandfather, Mr. A. Edmund Ashford Thorne, has left testamentary instructions naming you sole beneficiary of. Lorelei stopped reading. Her hands trembled with such intensity that the letters became blurs. Whitfield was heir to a fortune that existed before he built his empire. The man who prided himself on being self-made, who proclaimed his success as proof of superior will, had received his first million from a family that had abandoned him in childhood. The irony was cruel as January wind across the plains, and she understood, with tearing clarity, why he kept those letters in a secret hiding place. That discovery had demolished the myth he'd constructed about himself. The rejected child and the triumphant millionaire couldn't coexist in the same story. So he'd chosen to bury the child under layers of success and control, not knowing that buried ghosts always find a way out. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it. She left the office with her heart pounding in her temples and her head full of questions she didn't know how to formulate. That night, during the usual silent dinner, she observed him with new eyes. Every gesture acquired new meaning. The way he cut meat with surgical precision, control compensating for years of chaos. The manner in which he avoided talking about childhood, family, past, protection of wounds still suppurating beneath the surface. His obsession with order, cleanliness, predictability, antidote against the helplessness of one who grew up without certainties. "Something wrong?" he asked, noticing her scrutiny. "No, just thinking about how little we know each other." He put his silverware on the plate and looked at her intently. "What do you want to know?" It was an unexpected invitation, a bridge thrown across the abyss separating them. But Lorelei knew she couldn't reveal her discovery. Not yet. That information was dynamite, and she needed to find the right way to use it. "Tell me about your work," she said, opting for safe territory. "You've never really explained what you do." And so for 2 hours that stretched like warm caramel, Whitfield talked. Not about his past, but about his present. The companies he ran, the projects he developed, the dreams he still harbored of creating something significant. She listened with genuine attention, discovering a passionate man beneath the mask of coldness, someone who fervently believed in the transformative power of work and discipline. When they finally retired to sleep, she dared to take his hand as they climbed the stairs. He didn't pull away, and in the darkness of the bedroom, for the first time, it was he who sought her closeness, embracing her from behind with arms that trembled slightly. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for staying." She didn't respond with words. She just squeezed the hands surrounding her, those hands that painted in secret and signed anonymous donations and had picked up pomegranates from a market floor, and let the silence say what words couldn't. Outside, October's full moon bathed the Connecticut fields in ancient silver light, and somewhere in the manor, behind a locked door, waited secrets still to be discovered. Winter arrived in Litchfield County with the ferocity of a hungry wolf. Snow covered the fields as far as the eye could see, transforming the landscape into a white and motionless sea. The manor became an island of stone and silence, isolated from the world by impassable roads and perpetually grey skies. It was during those weeks of forced confinement that Lorelei finally discovered what was hidden in the annex. Whitfield had to stay in New York 3 days for a business emergency. Snow blocked his return, and phone calls had become more frequent and more tender, as if distance had loosened the knots binding them. "Will you be okay alone?" he asked with genuine concern that surprised her. "I'll survive. I have books, a fireplace, and Finger Lakes wine." His laugh on the other end of the line was unexpected. A real laugh, not the calculated grimace he used in society. "You're stronger than you think, Lorelei." That phrase accompanied her as she explored the house with new freedom. Without Whitfield's presence, the spaces seemed different, more spacious, less watched. And her curiosity, contained for months, finally found a way to liberate itself. The annex by the old carriage house had a side door facing the garden, a door she'd noticed but never examined closely. That afternoon of snow and silence, with the excuse of checking the heating boiler, she approached to investigate. The lock was rusted, a decisive push, and the handle gave with a metallic groan. Lorelei held her breath as the door opened toward a darkness that smelled of turpentine, oil, and something indefinable that could be crystallized solitude. She turned on her phone's flashlight and entered. What she found left her motionless for long minutes, unable to process what her eyes showed her. The walls were covered with paintings, not abstract canvases or decorative landscapes, but portraits of heartbreaking realism, faces of exhausted farm workers with furrows of earth in their wrinkles, forgotten elderly in empty villages with eyes containing oceans of loneliness, children with hungry gazes and smiles trying to hide the weight of their circumstances. Each brushstroke vibrated with contained emotion, each portrait screamed truths the artist couldn't pronounce aloud. In a corner, on an easel covered with stained cloth, was a half-finished canvas. Lorelei approached with steps of someone walking on thin ice and lifted the cloth with trembling fingers. It was a self-portrait, but not of the Whitfield she knew. The man in the painting was younger, perhaps 20, with eyes containing all the world's sadness. He stood before a closed door, hand extended toward the handle, frozen in the eternal instant of someone who desires to enter, but fears what he'll find on the other side. In the lower corner of the painting, in tiny letters, was a date and a phrase, 1998, the day I stopped knocking on doors. Lorelei cried. For the first time since her wedding, she cried with sobs that shook her entire body. Not tears of sadness for her marriage or frustration at her husband's emotional distance. She cried for the child in the painting, for the young man who'd learned to stop waiting, for the man who painted in secret as a way to heal wounds he didn't know how to name. She spent hours in that annex, examining each work, reading the dates and phrases accompanying them. The collection spanned more than 20 years of clandestine creation, 20 years of emotions poured onto canvases no one else had seen, 20 years of extraordinary talent hidden by shame or fear or the certainty that art wasn't a worthy occupation for a businessman. When she finally emerged, night had fallen over Connecticut like a black velvet cloak. Stars shone with intensity only winter cold allows, and the crescent moon drew bluish shadows on the pristine snow. Lorelei made a decision as she walked back to the main house. She wouldn't reveal her discovery directly. Doing so would violate a sanctuary, expose a vulnerability he hadn't chosen to share. Instead, she'd look for ways to create spaces where he could choose to show himself. That night, when Whitfield called from New York, she told him about her day with invented details. Reading by the fireplace, walk in the snowy garden, solitary dinner with background music. She didn't mention the annex, she didn't mention the paintings, but when he asked how she felt, she answered with a truth he couldn't fully understand. "I feel closer to you than ever." The silence on the other end of the line was long, charged with unformulated questions. "Me too," he said finally, "though I don't know how to explain why." It was enough. For now it was more than enough. Whitfield returned 4 days later, the road finally cleared, and a bouquet of winter flowers he'd bought at a gas station on the way. The gesture was clumsy, the bouquet's paper wrinkled, but Lorelei received it as if they were roses from a royal greenhouse. "They're dried hydrangeas," he said almost apologetically. It was all they had. "They're perfect," and they were. Perfect in their imperfection, like everything growing between them. That night after dinner, she brought out an art book she'd ordered during his absence, a volume on German expressionism with reproductions of works exploring human pain with brutal honesty. "I thought you might be interested," she said casually, leaving it on the living room table. He looked at it like someone looking at a grenade about to explode. But later, when he thought she was sleeping, she found him leafing through the pages with almost religious reverence, running his fingers over the reproductions, as if he could absorb technique through his skin. The bridge continued building, plank by plank, silence by silence. Spring arrived with the secret growing inside her. The morning nausea began in March, when Connecticut's cherry blossoms exploded in pink blooms, tinting the landscape with hope. At first, Lorelei attributed them to seasonal changes, heavier winter food, any explanation avoiding the truth her body already knew. But bodies don't lie, and when the third pregnancy test showed the 2 lines confirming the impossible, she sat on the edge of the bathtub and let vertigo consume her. A child, a new life forming in her womb while the marriage sheltering it still searched for its own form. The joy she should feel was tinged with terror. How to tell a man who feared losing control that something completely out of his control was growing? 3 weeks passed before she found the moment. 3 weeks of excuses to avoid wine, lies about passing dizzy spells, looks in the mirror searching for changes not yet visible. The chosen day was an April Sunday, with the Connecticut sky blue as Wedgwood porcelain, and the manor garden bursting with wildflowers that had survived abandonment. She prepared a special meal, roasted duck she'd ordered from a nearby restaurant because she hadn't yet mastered the art of the wood oven, and apple pie made with her own trembling hands. Whitfield noticed the effort as soon as he entered the dining room. "What are we celebrating?" he asked with suspicion not entirely hostile. "Nothing, everything. Sit down." They ate in tense silence, she moving food around her plate without tasting, he watching her with the attention of someone sensing something important was about to be revealed. When dessert arrived, Lorelei knew she couldn't wait any longer. "I'm pregnant." The words fell on the table like stones in a quiet pond. Whitfield remained completely still, fork suspended halfway to his mouth, eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't decipher. 5 minutes. 5 complete minutes of absolute silence where only bird song in the garden and the pounding of her heart in her ears could be heard. And then, for the 3rd time since she'd known him, Whitfield Ashford Thorne cried. But these tears were different from those in Woodstock, different from those with the old photograph on the balcony. These were tears of absolute panic, of a fear so deep it made his whole body tremble. He stood from his chair with such abruptness that the furniture fell backward, and he stepped back until his back hit the wall. "I don't know how," Deanie whispered in a broken voice. "No one ever taught me. I don't know how to be a father because I never had one. I don't know how to love a child because no one ever loved me. How am I going to? What am I going to? Lorelei stood slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal. Each step was calculated, each breath measured not to frighten him further. "Whitfield," she said in a soft but firm voice, "look at me." He obeyed. His eyes were red, his face haggard with anguish probably decades old. "Then we'll learn together," she continued, taking his freezing hands in hers. "You'll learn to be a father, and I'll learn to be a mother. Neither of us has an instruction manual. Nobody does. But you had parents who loved you. You know how it feels. You know what I know about how it feels," she responded with honesty that surprised herself. "I know my parents ignored me for years while they aged in their own world. I know I married you partly to escape the feeling of being invisible. I know love isn't learned from theory, but from practice. And I know, Whitfield, that I've seen you pick up pomegranates from the floor for a stranger. I've seen you leave tips that change lives. I've seen your secret donations to orphanages." His eyes widened in shock. "How? It doesn't matter how. What matters is that the man who does those things in secret has more capacity to love than he recognizes. He's just been hiding that capacity behind walls because someone long ago made him believe he didn't deserve to use it." He collapsed, not physically, but emotionally, like a building finally yielding to decades of internal erosion. She held him while he sobbed against her shoulder, feeling how the walls he'd built, stone by stone, began to truly crack. That night, for the first time, he told her everything. The mother who abandoned him in a Worcester hospital when he was 3, the foster homes where he never fit, the families who returned him like defective merchandise, the child who learned to expect nothing from anyone because expecting only led to pain. And he told her about discovering the inheritance, how that first million, coming from a family that had rejected him in childhood, had destroyed the only pride he had, the certainty of being self-made. How he'd used that money to build an empire, trying to prove he deserved something that was already his by right of blood. "Everything's a lie," he confessed in an exhausted voice. "The successful entrepreneur, the self-made man, everything's a story I invented to survive." Lorelei stroked his hair as he spoke, keeping each word like a precious jewel. "It's not a lie," she responded softly. "It's an incomplete version. The abandoned child, the frightened young man, the man who built an empire, the artist who paints in secret. They're all you. You don't have to choose one. You can be all of them." He looked at her with eyes that seemed to see the world for the first time. "Artist who paints in secret. I found the annex during the snowstorm, I'm sorry. But Whitfield, those paintings are extraordinary. That part of you deserves to exist as much as the businessman." The silence that followed was different from all previous ones. It was a silence of transformation, of pieces finally fitting into place. "I'm afraid," he admitted finally, "afraid of damaging this child like I was damaged. I know. And that fear is precisely what makes you capable of being a good father. Those who don't fear causing harm are the truly dangerous ones." They slept embracing that night, like shipwreck survivors clinging to floating wood. And in the dawn that followed, something had irreversibly changed between them. It was Lorelei's idea to return to Vermont. "We need to close a circle," she explained while they breakfasted in the kitchen that now smelled of fresh bread and real coffee, not uncomfortable silences and empty rituals. "There's something in Woodstock that was left unfinished." Whitfield knew exactly what she meant. The elderly man with the maple cane, the shout, the Waterford crystal shattering on the floor, that moment of shame that pursued him in dreams like a mocking goblin. "I don't think I can," he began. "You can, and you need to." The firmness in her voice was new. Pregnancy was transforming her in subtle but profound ways, more confident, more direct, less willing to accept excuses. He recognized in her a strength complementing his own weaknesses, and for the first time, he allowed someone else to take the reins. They traveled in May when Vermont's fields dressed in wildflowers, and the air smelled of apple blossoms and possibility. The Woodstock Inn welcomed them with the same colonial elegance as before, but this time, Whitfield's eyes saw everything differently. Where before he'd seen a stage to demonstrate his success, now he saw genuine beauty. The century-old pillars, the gardens overlooking the mountains, the golden light turning every corner into an impressionist painting. "It's beautiful," he murmured, almost to himself. "I didn't see it the first time. You were too busy controlling everything to see anything." There was no reproach in her voice, only statement of fact. He nodded, accepting the truth with new humility. They spent the first day exploring Woodstock as normal tourists, without agendas or expectations. They walked across covered bridges, admiring the valley views, tasted wines in century-old cellars, got lost in tree-lined streets where time seemed to have stopped centuries ago. And Whitfield, to both their surprise, found himself genuinely enjoying. It was the second day when Lorelei revealed her plan. "The man you yelled at that night, his name is Silas. He works in maintenance at the inn." Whitfield visibly paled. "How do you know that?" "I asked questions during our first honeymoon. After that night, I needed to understand what happened. The staff knows him well. He's been here for years, though his main work is elsewhere." "Elsewhere?" "He's a volunteer at an orphanage in Burlington. He's dedicated over 50 years to finding homes for abandoned children." The words hit Whitfield like a tidal wave. He let himself fall on the edge of the bed, face in his hands. "Of course," he whispered. "Of course he had to be someone like that." "There's more," Lorelei continued, sitting beside him. "When I learned what he did, I investigated further, and I discovered something I think you need to know." She then told him what she'd learned through contacts in social services, discreet calls, and carefully formulated questions. Silas wasn't just a volunteer. He'd been a social worker in Massachusetts during the 90s. He'd handled cases in the Worcester area. He'd tried, unsuccessfully, to find a permanent family for one particular child. A child the system identified with numbers instead of a name. "He knows you, Whitfield. Or he knew you. He was one of those who tried to help you when you were a child." The world stopped. Air became solid. Whitfield felt he was suffocating in revelations too large to process. "Why didn't he ever recognize me?" he asked in a strangled voice. 30 years have passed. You were a child and now you're an adult man with another name, another life, another everything. But he's carried the guilt of not having been able to help you for all these years. According to what I found out, he left Massachusetts shortly after your case closed. He moved here to Vermont and dedicated his life to compensating for what he considered his greatest failure. It wasn't his failure. It was a broken system, impossible circumstances. Exactly. But he doesn't see it that way, just like you don't see your own value. The meeting happened that afternoon in the courtyard where everything had begun. Silas was pruning wisteria with hands trembling from age but still capable. When he saw the couple approaching, his eyes clouded with impossible recognition. "You," he murmured, pointing at Whitfield with pruning shears he forgot to lower. "It can't be." "It is," Whitfield responded with a voice trying not to break. "And I need to apologize for that night, for yelling, for—" "No," the old man interrupted, dropping his tools and approaching with trembling steps. "No, it's I who should apologize. 30 years looking for a way to compensate for what I couldn't do for a frightened child from Worcester. And when I finally find him, I don't even recognize him." Tears came without permission, from both. Vermont rain began to fall as if the sky wanted to participate in that long-awaited reconciliation. They embraced in the downpour, two men united by decades of shared pain, while Lorelei watched from the arcades with her hand on her belly where the next generation grew. That night, in the oldest tavern in Woodstock, they shared stories over plates of Vermont cheddar and local craft beer. Silas told about the hundreds of children he'd helped find homes after leaving Massachusetts. Whitfield listened, with the hunger of someone who spent years fasting. And when the clock struck midnight, one last revelation fell on the table, like a moonbeam. "There's something else," Silas said, pulling yellow documents from a worn leather wallet. "Something I could only discover when the local historian finished his genealogical research a few months ago. Something probably no one else knows." The documents showed family trees, old birth certificates, parish records from Massachusetts towns, lines crossing and separating across generations. "Your wife?" he said, looking at Lorelei. What was your mother's maiden name? Thorne. Catherine Thorne. Silas nodded like someone confirming a suspicion. Cousins. Distant, separated by 4 generations, but cousins nonetheless. You both descend from the same family of Massachusetts landowners, the same family that abandoned a child it couldn't protect, and the same that produced the woman now redeeming him. Fate, or whatever moved existence's strings, had woven an impossible network of coincidences. They weren't strangers who'd met by chance in Boston. They were fragments of the same family story, separated by generations of secrets and reunited by forces neither could explain. Lorelei took Whitfield's hand under the table. He squeezed it with the strength of a castaway. "We're not prisoners of fate," she said finally, "but we're not completely free of it either. Perhaps," Whitfield added, looking at Silas with new eyes, "fate doesn't exist. Perhaps there are only people who refuse to give up. Like you." The old man smiled for the first time since the reunion. "Or like you, boy. You were always the most stubborn of all who passed through my hands. You never stopped fighting, even when everything indicated you should give up. I stopped knocking on doors long ago. But you kept building new ones. That counts too." They returned to the inn, walking under stars that seemed brighter than ever. And that night, in the same room where everything had begun with a cry of rage, Whitfield slept in peace for the first time in 30 years. The months following the return from Woodstock were a period of transformation and turbulence. Lorelei's pregnancy advanced, bringing with it physical changes that amazed and frightened her in equal parts. Her body ceased to belong exclusively to her. Now, it was a shared home, territory under construction. Whitfield observed each change with a mixture of fascination and terror. The new softness of her forms, the different glow in her skin, the growing curve of her belly. Everything reminded him that something irreversible was happening, something he couldn't control or plan or predict. He began therapy in New York, weekly sessions with a psychologist specializing in childhood trauma. At first, he attended like someone fulfilling a medical obligation, punctual, contained, offering only the strictly necessary. But week after week, layers peeled away. "Today she made me talk about the foster homes," he confessed one night, sitting next to Lorelei on the living room sofa that now had soft blankets and colorful cushions. "About the Brennan family, the ones who returned me after 6 months because I was too difficult." "And how did you feel?" "Furious. But then..." He hesitated, searching for words for emotions he was barely beginning to name. "Sad. For the child I was. For the first time I felt pity for him, instead of shame. It was monumental progress, though neither fully recognized it. Shame had been Whitfield's jailer for decades, keeping him prisoner of a narrative where he was a defect, not a victim. Beginning to see his story differently was demolishing the foundations on which he'd built his identity. But with demolition came chaos. There were nights when nightmares woke him soaked in sweat, screaming names of people Lorelei didn't know. There were days when he locked himself in the office for hours, unable to work but unable also to face the world. There were moments of explosive irritability that left him trembling with remorse afterward. "I'm getting worse," he said one July morning, with deep circles and a worn voice. "Before at least I functioned. Now I'm a disaster." "You're not getting worse," Lorelei responded with patience that sometimes surprised herself. "You're thawing, and thawing hurts more than staying frozen." The metaphor seemed to resonate in him. He remained silent for a long while, processing it. "How do you know these things?" he asked finally. "Because I was frozen too, in my way, less dramatic, but frozen nonetheless, invisible in my own family, floating through life without anchor, marrying a stranger to escape instead of confronting. And now I'm thawing too. And you're right. It hurts like hell." Sharing vulnerabilities became their new language. Nighttime conversations on the bedroom balcony, with the Connecticut sky displaying constellations Whitfield had learned to name from astronomy books bought for their future child, were more effective therapy than any professional session. But the real break came in August, 1 week before the expected due date. Whitfield received a call from his financial director in New York. The words he heard made his face lose all color. "What's wrong?" Lorelei asked, seeing him hang up with trembling hands. An investigative journalist. He's been digging into my origins. Discovered the inheritance, the orphanage, everything. Wants to publish an article. The magnate who invented his own story. Panic consumed him. Everything he'd built, everything he'd presented to the world as truth, was about to publicly crumble. The humiliation would be total. Partners would see him as a fraud. Competitors would exploit his weakness. The carefully raised empire would totter on foundations of exposed lies. Maybe, Lorelei said after listening to his spiral of imagined catastrophes, it's not as terrible as you think. Not terrible, it's going to destroy me. Or will it free you? The question stopped him cold. What? You've spent 30 years maintaining a farce, lying about who you are, where you come from, how you got here. Aren't you exhausted? Wouldn't it be a relief if the world knew the truth and you could stop pretending? The truth is shameful. The truth is that an abandoned child survived the system, found a path, built something significant. Where's the shame in that? The inheritance, he began. What about the inheritance? Does it invalidate everything you've accomplished after? Does the initial money eliminate decades of work, risk, creation? If I gave you seeds and you cultivated an extraordinary garden, would the credit be mine for the seeds or yours for the garden? He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. When did you become so wise? When I fell in love with a complicated man who forced me to grow to reach him. That night, Whitfield made a decision. He called the journalist and offered a complete interview, not to defend himself or control the narrative, but to tell the whole truth for the first time in his life. The child from Worcester, the foster homes, the unexpected inheritance, the empire built on foundations of trauma and determination, the secret donations, the hidden paintings, everything. If they're going to know my story, he said, I prefer they hear it in my own voice. The interview was published 3 days before his son's birth. The headline was different from what the journalist had originally planned. The entrepreneur who turned abandonment into purpose. The true story of Whitfield Thorne. Reactions were mixed. Some accused him of emotional manipulation. Others celebrated him as an example of resilience. Partners, to his surprise, expressed respect for his honesty, and employees, many of whom had suffered his coldness for years, began to see him in a different light. But the most important thing happened in the Litchfield County Manor, where Lorelei read the article with tears she didn't try to contain. I'm proud of you, she said simply, and those 4 words weighed more than decades of business success. The pain began at dawn on a Tuesday in August, when the sky over Connecticut burned in tones of fire and promise. Lorelei woke with a contraction that stole her breath, and she knew immediately the moment had come. Whitfield, she whispered, shaking him gently. It's time. He jumped from bed with the agility of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his imagination. He'd had bags packed for weeks. The route to the hospital memorized to the last turn, emergency numbers programmed on speed dial. Control was his refuge, and he'd poured all his planning capacity into preparing for this day. But no plan survives contact with reality. Traffic toward New York was impossible. An accident on the highway had turned the road into an endless parking lot. Contractions accelerated, while the car remained motionless between trucks and buses. Lorelei breathed with technique learned in prenatal classes, but fear began climbing up her throat. We won't make it, she said with a voice trying not to tremble. We'll make it, he responded with conviction he didn't feel. They didn't make it. Or rather, they made it to Connecticut Valley Hospital instead of Mount Sinai in New York, with Lorelei already fully dilated, and the baby decided to meet the world without waiting for anyone. What followed were hours that felt like years compressed into minutes. Pain was a living animal devouring and spitting her out in waves. Whitfield stayed by her side, holding her hand while she squeezed with enough force to leave marks that would last days. I can't, she moaned at some point in the middle of the night. It's too much. I can't anymore. You can, he responded with a voice that for the first time didn't sound like control but like genuine faith. You're the strongest woman I know. You've transformed a broken man without even trying. You can do this. The words pierced her like a ray of light in a storm. She clung to them while she pushed, while she screamed, while her body performed the universe's most ancient miracle. And then, at 4:47 in the morning of August 23rd, a new cry filled the room. The nurse placed the baby on Lorelei's chest, a tiny bundle of wrinkled skin and closed fists looking at her with dark, unfathomable eyes. She cried without shame, with sobs mixing exhaustion, relief, and a love so intense it almost hurt. Whitfield remained motionless beside the bed, looking at the creature as if it were an apparition from another world. When the nurse offered him the chance to hold the baby, he instinctively stepped back. "I don't know," he began, ancient fear resurfacing. "What if I do it wrong? What if I hurt him?" Lorelei looked at him with exhausted but certain eyes. "Come here." He obeyed like an automaton. She guided his arms until they formed the correct cradle, then gently placed the baby in them. "His name is Theodore," she said, "like your real grandfather, the one who left you the inheritance. It's time that name meant something good." Whitfield looked at the child he held, so small, so perfectly formed, so completely dependent on him. Terror was still there, crouching in the corners of his mind, but something more powerful eclipsed it, a fierce, almost animal determination to protect this life with everything he had. "I promise you," he whispered, bending until his lips almost touched the baby's forehead. "You'll always know you're loved. You'll always know your name. You'll always know you matter. Never, ever will you have to wonder if someone loves you." Tears fell on the blanket, wrapping Theodore, drops of salt that were also drops of healing. 30 years of wounds began closing in that instant, not completely, not magically, but irreversibly. Lorelei watched her husband hold their son, and she knew with certainty that everything had been worth it. The months of silence, the nights of distance, the painful revelations, the hard work of building trust where before there'd been only walls. Everything had led to this moment, a broken man learning to love through his son's eyes. "You know what else?" she added softly. "He'll also always know that people can change, that a shout isn't the end of any story, that night in Woodstock, when I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life, was actually the beginning of everything." Whitfield looked at her with eyes containing oceans. "I love you," he said, and it was the first time he'd uttered those words since the wedding. "I don't know if I'm doing it right. I don't know if what I feel is what I'm supposed to feel, but I know you're the best thing that ever happened to me, and this child is a miracle I don't deserve, but will defend with my life." "You're doing it right," she responded. "You're doing better than right." Outside, dawn painted the Connecticut sky with the same colors of the day he'd come into the world. A new day, a new life, a new chance to do things differently. The first months of fatherhood were an emotional roller coaster Whitfield had never imagined. The overwhelming tenderness of watching Theodore sleep contrasted with visceral panic every time the baby cried, for no apparent reason. The pride of each small achievement, the first smile, the first babble, mixed with terror of not doing enough, well enough, perfectly enough. "You can't be perfect," Lorelei constantly reminded him. "You just need to be present." But being present was precisely what he'd never learned. His body occupied space near the crib. His hands changed diapers with an engineer's efficiency. But his mind frequently escaped toward dark territories where ancient voices whispered he would fail, that he was incapable, that his parents' blood had condemned him before birth. The first crisis came when Theodore turned 4 months. It was during a night of inconsolable crying, one of those that makes you question every life decision that led to that moment. Lorelei was exhausted with fever from a cold the baby had given her. Whitfield offered to handle the night alone. At 3 in the morning, that cursed hour that pursued him like a ghost, he found himself alone in the baby's room with a child, screaming endlessly. He'd fed him, changed him, rocked him, sung, off-key, everything without success. And then, in the abyss of exhaustion, something dark emerged from the depths. "Be quiet," he shouted, and the sound of his own voice paralyzed him. The baby, frightened by the volume, cried even louder, but Whitfield no longer heard him. He'd backed up against the room's wall, body trembling and eyes fixed on his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. That's how Lorelei found him 20 minutes later, drawn by the persistent crying. He was still pressed against the wall, murmuring something incomprehensible, while tears ran down his cheeks. "I'm like them," he whispered when she approached. "I'm exactly like them." "No," she responded firmly, first taking the baby to calm him, and then sitting next to her husband on the floor. "You're not like them." I yelled at him. At my own 4-month-old son, I yelled. "You yelled because you were exhausted and scared and overwhelmed. That makes you human, not a monster. What if next time is worse? What if I can't control myself? Then we'll ask for help, more therapy, more support, whatever it takes. But listen to me carefully, Whitfield. The difference between you and those who hurt you isn't the absence of dark impulses. It's what you do after feeling them." She looked him in the eyes with an intensity that admitted no reply. "You could have shaken the baby, left him alone, fled. Instead, you moved away to protect him. You stayed in the room but put distance. And when you saw me, the first thing you did was feel shame and remorse. You know how many truly abusive parents feel that? None. Abusers justify, deny, blame. You take responsibility even when you haven't done anything truly wrong." He wanted to believe her, desperately wanted to believe her, but the voices in his head were older and more persistent. "I need more time away from him," he finally admitted, "until I'm more stable. I don't trust myself." Lorelei nodded without judging him. "Then we take that time, but you don't disappear. You're present in the parts you can handle, and we work together on the ones you can't. This is a team, Whitfield. You don't have to carry everything alone." The following months were constant adjustment. Whitfield increased therapy sessions, started medication for anxiety he'd resisted for years, and learned to recognize signs he was reaching his limit before reaching it. Lorelei hired domestic help for the most difficult nights, not as abandonment of responsibility, but as recognition that raising a child is communal work, not individual. Silas came from Vermont for a visit that extended weeks. The old man, with wisdom of someone who'd seen thousands of family stories, offered invaluable perspective. "Fear of repeating the cycle," he said one afternoon while they had coffee in the transformed garden, now full of flowers Lorelei had planted, "is precisely what breaks it. Parents who really harm their children are those who believe they deserve to do so, not those who fear even breathing wrong." "But the impulse was there," Whitfield insisted. "The rage, frustration, wanting to what? Silence him. All parents feel that at 3 in the morning with a baby who won't stop crying. It's biology, not evil. What matters is the next step. And your next step was to protect him from yourself. That, son, is exactly what a good father does." The word son floated in the air between them, loaded with meanings neither tried to analyze. But something softened in Whitfield's face, as if a very ancient tension finally found relief. Theodore turned 1 in August, exactly when the manor garden exploded with sunflowers Lorelei had planted as a symbol of hope. The party was small, just the 3 of them, Silas, and some village neighbors who'd been adopted as extended family during the year. Whitfield carried his son during most of the celebration, no longer with the paralyzed fear of before, but with naturalness won through struggle. When Theodore pointed at an especially tall sunflower and babbled something that sounded vaguely like flower, he felt his heart explode in a completely new way. "You're doing well," Lorelei murmured in his ear, "better than well." And this time, for the first time, he almost believed her. Theodore's second year was the year of visible transformations. It began with the annex. That secret space where Whitfield had painted for decades in solitude finally opened its doors. It was Lorelei's idea to turn it into something more than a hiding place. "There are children in the village who've never touched a brush," she said one spring morning, while they watched Theodore try to eat a colored crayon. "Children from working families who can't afford art classes. What if what? What if we shared this?" Initial fear was almost paralyzing. Exposing his art meant exposing himself, showing the most vulnerable parts of his being to strange eyes. But Whitfield had learned something important during his year of imperfect fatherhood. Growth only happened on the other side of fear. Classes began in May, with 5 shy children who arrived accompanied by skeptical parents. The millionaire entrepreneur giving free painting classes was strange news in a village where most worked on farms or in factories. The first Saturday was glorious disaster. Paint everywhere, children running, A painting accidentally destroyed when a 6-year-old tripped over the easel. Whitfield felt familiar frustration growing, that impulse to control order, dominate chaos. But then a 7-year-old girl with undone braids and a gap-toothed smile took his blue-stained hand and said with disarming innocence, "You paint sadness very beautifully. Will you teach me?" The world stopped. In that girl he saw something that shook him to his foundations. He saw the child he'd been. The one seeking connection through art. The one expressing with colors what he couldn't say with words. "I can teach you happiness too," he responded, kneeling to her height. And he did. That day, and every Saturday that followed. Classes grew from 5 children to 15, then to 25. The annex became too small, so they renovated the old barn to create a larger space. Walls filled with children's works that had more life and joy than anything Whitfield had painted alone for decades. "You're different when you teach," Lorelei observed one afternoon, watching him explain color-mixing techniques to a group of mesmerized children. "Softer, more present." "They don't expect me to be perfect," he responded. "They just expect me to be there." It was a lesson he kept learning again and again in ever deeper ways. Perfection was the enemy of presence. Control was the enemy of connection. And fear, though it never disappeared completely, could coexist with love if one learned to make space for it without letting it command. Theodore grew surrounded by brushes, canvases, and older children who treated him like an adored mascot. His first clear words, besides the inevitable mama and dada, were blue and more. Pronounced while he imperiously pointed toward paint jars, adults kept out of his reach. "He'll be an artist," Silas predicted during one of his quarterly visits. "He'll be whatever he wants to be," Whitfield corrected, "and he'll know we'll support him whatever it is." That promise, simple in appearance, contained oceans of intention. The child who never received unconditional support was determined to give it. The man who grew up without a model of fatherhood was creating a new one, day by day, error by error, correction by correction. The company's transformation came almost as natural consequence. Whitfield, no longer interested in accumulating for accumulation's sake, redirected resources toward projects with purpose. Scholarships for orphans wanting to study art therapy programs in children's hospitals, reform of foster care institutions in Massachusetts, those same ones where he'd suffered decades earlier. "It's not charity," he explained to partners questioning these investments. "It's long-term investment, in human capital, in what really matters." Some partners left, unable to understand the new direction. Others stayed, surprised to discover social projects generated unexpected returns, better corporate image, more committed employees, connections with previously ignored markets. The empire didn't crumble as some had predicted. It transformed. And amid all that, the marriage flourished in ways neither had anticipated. Nights were no longer uncomfortable silences, but conversations extending until dawn. Mornings were no longer parallel routines, but genuine encounters over coffee cups and shared plans. The love Lorelei had hoped to find at the wedding had finally arrived. Not as a sudden sunbeam, but as a slow dawn illuminating every dark corner. "Do you regret it?" Whitfield asked one summer night, while they watched stars from the bedroom balcony with Theodore asleep between them. "Marrying me before really knowing me?" "I regret many things," she responded with honesty that no longer frightened them. "Not having confronted my own ghosts earlier, having sought escape instead of growth, having waited for you to save me when I should save myself. But marrying you, no, because the man I married and the man you are now are the same person at different stages of the journey, and I prefer walking that journey with you than alone." He kissed her under the Connecticut stars, with their son asleep between them and the future opening like a field of infinite possibilities. It wasn't a fairy tale happy ending, it was something better, a midpoint in a story that would continue developing, with its ups and downs, its errors and corrections, its imperfect and beautiful humanity. 3 years after Theodore's birth, a letter arrived that no one expected. It came from Massachusetts, from a lawyer specializing in family law. The content was simple but explosive. Whitfield's biological mother wanted to contact him. She was alive, 72 years old, living in a coastal town near Cape Cod, and had spent decades searching for the son she'd abandoned in circumstances she'd never been able to explain. Whitfield held the letter with hands that didn't tremble but didn't move either. His face was a mask Lorelei had learned to read. Behind the apparent calm, a storm of emotions battled for dominance. "You don't have to respond," she said softly. "You don't owe her anything." "I know. But I need to know. I need to understand why." The trip to Cape Cod was silent and tense. Theodore stayed with Silas, who'd come expressly to care for him. Lorelei drove while Whitfield watched the landscape pass without really seeing it, lost in mental preparations for a meeting he'd imagined and feared for 40 years. The town was exactly like New England postcards. White houses with blue shutters, narrow streets smelling of sea and salt roses, elderly people playing checkers on shaded porches. The house of Evelyn Marsh, the name appearing on the documents, was modest but well kept, with pots of red geraniums at every window. She waited for them at the door. A small woman, bent by years but with eyes Whitfield recognized immediately. They were his own, looking at him from a face marked by time and remorse. "Whitfield," she whispered, and his name in that voice produced a shiver running down his entire spine. "Evelyn," he responded, unable to call her mother. The story she'd told during the following hours was more complex and sadder than he'd imagined. It hadn't been abandonment from cruelty or indifference. It had been a combination of extreme poverty, undiagnosed mental illness, and a healthcare system that systematically failed the most vulnerable. Evelyn had suffered severe postpartum depression that in that era didn't even have a name. Doctors had declared her incapable of caring for a baby, and social services had taken him temporarily while she recovered. But recovery never came. Visits became more spaced, papers were lost in Kafkaesque bureaucracies, and when she finally managed to stabilize years later, the system told her son had been adopted, and she had no right to search for him. "But I never stopped trying," she assured with a broken voice. "Every year I sent letters, made calls, visited offices. No one helped me. They said it was better for you, that you already had a family, that I would only cause harm." "I never had a family," Whitfield responded with bitterness he didn't try to hide. "They returned me every time. No one ever wanted me." Evelyn collapsed. Sobs shook her frail body while she repeated, "I'm sorry," like a broken mantra. And Lorelei, observing the scene from her place by the window, saw something change in her husband's face. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Perhaps it never would be completely. But it was something resembling understanding, acceptance that life was more complicated than simple narratives allowed, that victims could create victims without intending to. That pain transmitted through generations like a genetic disease of the soul. "I have a son," Whitfield said finally, interrupting the sobs. "His name is Theodore. He's 3 years old, and I've promised him he'll always know he's loved." Evelyn looked at him with reddened eyes but full of fragile hope. "Could I, someday, meet him?" The question hung suspended in the salt air, entering through the window. Whitfield looked at Lorelei, seeking guidance in completely unknown territory. She returned his gaze with the serenity of someone who trusts his judgment. "I don't know," he responded honestly. "I need time. I need to process all this, but I'm not closing the door." It was more than Evelyn had expected. She nodded with silent gratitude, without pressing, without demanding. And when they finally said goodbye at the threshold of that modest house, she gave him a cardboard box she'd kept for 40 years. "These are your things," she explained. "Everything I had. Photos, a baby booty, the little blanket you arrived at the hospital in. I always kept them, in case someday." Whitfield took the box without opening it. The pressure in his chest was almost unbearable, but something stronger kept him standing. The certainty he could survive this, that he'd survived worse, that beyond pain there was always some form of continuity. "Thank you," he said, and it was gratitude for more than the box, for never stopping searching, for explaining, for being alive. The return trip was different from the outward one. Whitfield cried most of the way, with Lorelei holding his free hand while she drove, but the tears were no longer only of pain. They also contained relief, closure, the strange peace of someone who finally understands a story that had been a riddle his entire life. When they arrived at the manor and Theodore ran toward them with open arms shouting, "Daddy, Mommy!" Whitfield lifted him and hugged him with a force containing all the generations who hadn't been able to embrace. "I love you," he whispered against his son's dark hair. "More than words can say, more than I understand myself." Theodore, too small to comprehend the weight of that moment, simply responded, "I love you too, Daddy. Will you paint me a dragon?" And Whitfield laughed. A laugh emerging from some deep and healed place, a laugh containing more years of evolution than the decades he'd lived. "I'll paint you 1,000 dragons," he promised, "and they'll all be blue because it's your favorite color." So the 5th wedding anniversary coincided with the inauguration of the Theodore Foundation, the most ambitious project Whitfield had ever undertaken. The headquarters was in Boston, in a rehabilitated building in Dorchester that had been a foster home during the years he'd passed through the system. The irony wasn't accidental. He'd bought that building specifically to transform it, to convert a place of pain into a space of hope. The foundation offered everything: art programs for at-risk children, psychological support for adoptive families, educational scholarships, job training workshops for young people leaving the system at majority. Each program had been designed with input from people who'd lived the deficiencies being remedied, including Whitfield himself. The inauguration gathered journalists, politicians, entrepreneurs, and more importantly, dozens of families and children who'd already benefited from pilot programs. The old dining room where Whitfield had eaten watery soups and stale bread was now a children's art gallery, with works radiating the joy he'd never had opportunity to express at that age. Lorelei watched her husband move among guests with a naturalness that would have been impossible 5 years earlier. The man who avoided eye contact now held conversations with strangers. The cold entrepreneur now knelt to talk with children, showing him their drawings. The solitary man who painted in secret now explained artistic techniques to groups of interested adults. "You've created something beautiful," Silas said, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of champagne. "You both have." "He's done the hard work," she responded. "I've only been present. Being present is the hardest work of all, especially when the other person does everything possible to push you away." He was right, of course. The old man was always right about important things. Theodore ran between adults' legs, his laughter resonating through hallways like music chasing away ancient ghosts. At 5 years old, he was a confident and expressive child, so different from the father he'd been at that age, that sometimes Whitfield watched him in amazement. "What are you thinking?" Lorelei asked, noticing his expression. "That it works. The cycle can be broken. Something new can be created from the ashes of what's broken." The inauguration speech was a moment that would remain engraved in all present's memory. Whitfield climbed the small improvised stage with papers he didn't need because he spoke from the heart. He told his story, all of it, without embellishment or omissions: the abandonment, the foster homes, the families who returned him, the rage that consumed him for years, the wall of ice he built to survive. He also told about transformation, the honeymoon in Woodstock, the shout that shamed him but was the beginning of awakening, the woman who chose to stay when she had every reason to flee, the son who taught him love isn't learned from books. "This foundation exists because someone gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it," he concluded, eyes bright but voice firm. "It exists because I believe every child deserves those second chances, and thirds, and as many as necessary. It exists because pain doesn't have to be destiny, because what happens to us doesn't determine who we'll be, only influences the starting point, and because in the end we're all capable of more love than we believe possible." The applause was long and genuine, but the most significant moment came afterward, when an elderly woman approached with hesitant steps. Whitfield recognized her immediately. It was Evelyn, his biological mother, whom he'd invited but hadn't expected to attend. They looked at each other for seconds containing decades. Then, without words, he embraced her, not with the rigidity of someone fulfilling obligation, but with the tenderness of someone finally accepting that forgiveness isn't weakness, but supreme strength. "Thank you for coming," he murmured against her grey hair. "Thank you for letting me," she responded. Lorelei observed the scene with tears she didn't try to hide. Beside her, Theodore tugged on her hand. "Mommy, who's that lady hugging Daddy?" She's his mother. Your grandmother. Daddy has a mother. The childish surprise was genuine. I thought he only had Silas as a grandfather. Now he has both, and so do you. Theodore seemed to process this information with the excessive seriousness of small children facing great revelations. So, can I get more birthday presents? Lorelei laughed despite the tears, or perhaps because of them. Maybe, but more importantly, you can have more love, and that's always good. Love is good, Theodore repeated with absolute conviction. Daddy always tells me. He says love is the only thing that really matters. It was true. Whitfield said it constantly, like a mantra he needed to repeat to keep believing it, and each time he said it, it became a bit truer, a bit more real, a bit more part of who he was instead of who he was trying to be. The day ended with a family dinner at a nearby restaurant. Whitfield, Lorelei, Theodore, Silas, and Evelyn. 5 people united by bonds of blood and choice, of history and hope. Conversation flowed with difficulties proper to those still getting to know each other, but also with the ease of those sharing something fundamental. How did you end up here? Evelyn asked Silas. In this family? The old man smiled with the wisdom of his 80-some years. I stumbled with the wrong cane at the right moment. Or maybe it was the wrong moment and the right cane. You never know with these things. Whitfield raised his glass. To stumbles that lead us where we need to be. To shouts that break necessary silences, Lorelei added. To second chances, Silas continued. To time that heals all, Evelyn murmured. To blue dragons, Theodore shouted, raising his juice glass. And everyone laughed, because sometimes children have the last word, and that word is exactly the right one. 10 years after that night in Woodstock, where a cry of rage had initiated a transformation impossible to predict, Whitfield Ashford Thorne walked through the Litchfield County Manor Garden with his 10-year-old son on one side and his 7-year-old daughter on the other. Little Lorelei, named thus in honor of her mother, pulled on his left hand while pointing at the sunflowers that had become family tradition. Each August, without fail, the family planted new seeds that bloomed like terrestrial suns just in time for Theodore's birthday. Daddy, this sunflower is the tallest, the girl said with emotion. Look, it's taller than you. You're right, he responded, feigning surprise. Maybe we should worry. If they keep growing like this, soon they'll rule the world. Sunflowers can't rule. Theodore intervened with the superiority of his 10 years. They don't have brains. And who says you need a brain to rule? Lorelei asked from the porch, where she was preparing the table for family lunch. Look at politics. Whitfield laughed with the ease of someone who'd learned that laughter is a form of love. He approached his wife and kissed her cheek, while the children ran toward the kitchen, drawn by the smell of fresh omelette. Remember when this garden was just thorns and silence? He asked, observing the transformed landscape. I remember everything, she responded. Every difficult moment and every small triumph. Every time I thought we wouldn't make it and every time we did anyway. Do you regret anything? It was a question he asked periodically, needing confirmation the path had been worth it. She'd learned to answer without tiring. I regret not taking more photos at the beginning. Of Theodore's first steps, the first time you said I love you without it costing you a world. Those moments should be documented. They're documented here, he said, touching his chest. Every one of them. Lunch gathered the entire extended family. Silas, now 90 years old but mind still sharp, presided over the table with the authority of natural patriarchs. Evelyn, who'd found a late but real home in Litchfield County, helped serve while exchanging recipes with the cook. Children from painting classes, many now teenagers, came and went with the confidence of those who know they're welcome. It's curious, Silas commented during dessert, how a single night can change so many lives. It wasn't just one night, Whitfield corrected. It was every day after it, every choice to continue, not to give up, to try again when we failed. The night was the seed, Lorelei added. But the garden, we built it together. Theodore, who'd been listening with children's selective attention at his age, raised his hand as if in class. Daddy, can I ask something? Always. Were you bad before? People say you were bad before you met Mom. The silence that followed was dense, but not uncomfortable. Whitfield looked at his son with a seriousness the child deserved. I wasn't bad, he responded finally. I was lost, scared. I'd built armor so thick to protect myself that I couldn't feel anything anymore, neither good nor bad. And when you can't feel, sometimes you cause harm without realizing it. And Mom helped you take off the armor? Your mother helped me understand I didn't need it, that I could be vulnerable and survive, that asking for help wasn't weakness. That loving didn't mean losing control, but truly gaining it. And you're not afraid anymore. The question was deeper than the child probably understood. Whitfield took a moment before responding. I'm afraid every day. Afraid of not being enough for you, of making mistakes that hurt you, of repeating patterns I promised to break. But I've learned fear doesn't have to paralyze you. It can be a travel companion instead of a jailer. Theodore nodded with solemnity. That's like what you say in painting classes, that mistakes aren't the end, they're the beginning of something new. Exactly. See? You're already wiser than I was at your age. Well, little Lorelei intervened with 7-year-old impatience. I also have a question. When do we eat the cake? The table erupted in laughter that lightened the moment's gravity. Evelyn rose to fetch the apple pie she'd prepared following a generations-old recipe, while Silas began telling a story from when he was young and made cakes for children at the Burlington orphanage. Later, when the sun began descending over Connecticut fields painting the sky in oranges and purples, Whitfield stepped away from the group and walked to the old annex that was now a community art studio. Walls were still covered with paintings, but no longer just his. There were works by children, teenagers, adults who'd discovered color therapy. Each canvas told a transformation story. In a corner, protected by glass, was the self-portrait he'd painted more than 25 years ago. The young man with sad eyes before the closed door. Whitfield contemplated it for long minutes, recognizing that boy but also feeling infinitely distant from him. Daddy? Theodore had entered silently and stood beside him. That's you, right? When you were young. Yes. Why are you sad in the painting? Because back then I didn't know the door would eventually open. And did it open? Whitfield looked at his son. 10 years of life built with imperfect but constant love. 10 years of corrected errors and learned lessons. 10 years of grace earned through struggle. It opened, he confirmed, and on the other side I found more than I'd ever dared hope for. Theodore took his hand as he'd done since he was small, with the naturalness of someone who takes his father's love for granted. Can I ask you something? Anything. Will you teach me to paint something happy? Not sad like that painting. Something with sunflowers and dragons and Mom and my sister and you and all of us. The request was simple but contained universes. Whitfield felt his heart grow 3 sizes, like a character from a Christmas tale. I'll teach you, he promised, and we'll hang it here next to the sad painting, so anyone who sees both understands that the story doesn't end where it seems to end, that there are always more pages to write. They left the annex hand in hand, father and son, walking toward where the rest of the family waited under sunflowers, bending with the evening breeze. Lorelei looked up when she saw them approach, and her smile contained the entire story they'd built together. The difficult beginnings, the years of work, the moments of doubt and certainty, the sleepless nights and dawns of hope. Everything okay? She asked when they reached her side. Everything's okay, Whitfield responded, sitting beside her and putting an arm around her shoulders. Everything is exactly as it should be. And it was true. Not perfectly, because perfection was an illusion he'd learned not to pursue, but completely, with that completeness that only comes from having traveled an entire path regardless of detours. The sun set over Litchfield County, painting the world in gold and shadow. Sunflowers closed their petals for nocturnal sleep. Children finally surrendered to fatigue and were carried to their beds. The elders remained in the garden a while longer, savoring the comfortable silence of those who don't need words to communicate. And somewhere in the universe, the young version of Whitfield, the one who painted his sadness before closed doors, perhaps felt something lighten, that his story hadn't ended in abandonment and solitude, that the child no one wanted had grown to create something beautiful from broken fragments. Sometimes the moments that shame us most are portals to who we should become, and sometimes A cry of rage during a honeymoon is the first step of a journey that leads, against all expectation, toward home.